First of all, I'd like to thank the three fire science exchanges for sponsoring this. I really appreciate the opportunity to present on the work that we've been doing over the past 10 to 15 years. Before I get started, I just want to acknowledge my two collaborators that I've listed here. Justin Derner is a rangeland scientist with the Rangeland Resources Research Unit out of Cheyenne, Wyoming. And Justin started several of the long-term prescribed burning experiments back in the 2000s that I'll talk about today. And also want to acknowledge Dan Milchunas from Colorado State University. Dan's been working in the shortgrass steppe for over 30 years, and back in the mid-90s he initiated a series of studies with Pawnee National Grassland on prescribed burning. Again, both of them allowed me to become a collaborator on these projects when I started working here, and I'll be talking about those studies today. Okay, so what I want to do with this webinar is first I'll just talk briefly about climate gradients and fire in the Great Plains, and a little bit on traditional and contemporary perspectives on fire use in the Great Plains. And then I'm going to talk about just some of the technical aspects of getting prescribed burns to work in the low fuel environment of the shortgrass. And then I'll get into the ecology of prescribed burning effects on forage production, livestock production, unpalatable plant species, and then wildlife habitat. And this last one, wildlife habitat, is really what's driven a lot of the interest in recent years in prescribed burning in the shortgrass steppe. So in looking at the Great Plains or the central grassland regions of the United States, there's a lot of different ways to divide up this region into grassland types. I like this broad classification shown in this slide because it reflects some of the broad climate gradients. And what I'm really going to be focusing on today is work done in that orange region in the southern and westernmost portion of the Great Plains. And some of it is also going to be applicable to the western portion of the northern mixed prairie. But this is where most of the work that we've done is coming from. The two main climatic gradients that we have, first of all, we have a west to east gradient in precipitation, and as a result, west to east gradient in net primary production. That has a huge effect on fire ecology. And of course, here in the eastern Great Plains, fire is widely used. We have a lot of research on the role of fire in tall grass prairie and in mixed grass prairies. In the western part, much lower fuel loads and a little bit less work on the role of fire. We also have an important temperature gradient that runs from north to south. So when we're talking about the shortgrass steppe, we're talking about the driest and the warmest part of the Great Plains. The dry aspect of it is resulting in a reduction in fuel loads, considerable reduction in fuel loads compared to the eastern parts of the Great Plains. So low fuel loads, and but also this is a pretty warm part of the Great Plains, so we have a lot of opportunities for fire ignition during dry parts of the year, or during dormant portions of the year. Now, I don't have any way of making a firm statement about what the historic fire return interval was in the shortgrass steppe. I know that when I worked with the land fire program 5 or 6 years ago, they said that of all the different ecologists they interviewed in this region, there's a lot of disagreement over what the fire return intervals were here historically. And I think that's just because we don't have trees, we don't have a good way of using fire scars on trees to assess fire regimes. But we do know that historically fire was a significant component of the shortgrass steppe. Wright and Bailey, in their book on fire ecology, noted that in the semi-arid areas, big prairie fires in the past usually occurred during drought years that followed 1 to 3 years of above average precipitation because of the abundant and continuous fuel. And so we do have a lot of interannual variability in the potential for fires. And we know that we have a lot of small wildfires frequently in the western Great Plains, but historically there's also good evidence there were large fires that were able to spread over broad areas. An example from Wright and Bailey's book, they noted that a fire in 1885 that started near the Arkansas River in western Kansas jumped the Cimarron River, burned across the northern plains of Texas, and did not stop until it reached the rugged Canadian river breaks, a distance of 175 miles, and about 1 million acres of the XIT ranch alone burned in Texas. And a more recent example came from Lee County, New Mexico, where a fire traveled 26 miles, burned 52 square miles, and crossed 3 major highways, and was finally stopped by a plowed field. So today we have a different situation with an extensive network of roads, croplands, and volunteer fire departments that effectively suppress wildfires. In terms of traditional thinking on use of fire in managing rangelands, just want to start out by contrasting what happens in the tallgrass prairies, at least in the southern portions in the Flint Hills of Kansas and Oklahoma, where, like in this photo, you have entire ranches or at least entire pastures burned annually. That's done to enhance forage quality, remove all that old stem biomass. And again, whole pastures are burned to encourage uniform utilization by livestock. And on the other side of the Great Plains in the shortgrass, we have fires widely suppressed and rarely used to manage rangeland. So the reasons for this, in tallgrass, we know that we have substantial benefits of fire to livestock production by enhancing forage quality, removing standing dead, and increasing access to forage by livestock. We also have major issues in the eastern Great Plains with tree and shrub encroachment, particularly juniper in both mixed and tallgrass prairies. And juniper encroachment is really starting to be a major impetus for the use of prescribed fire in the eastern half of the Great Plains. And also you have adequate fuels for burning every year. So in the shortgrass steppe, you have the opposite situation. A lot of livestock producers have concerns about the effects of livestock production, effects of fire on livestock production, mainly because of concerns about losing forage quantity. We really don't have any issues with tree and shrub encroachment. I'll talk a little bit about cactus and subshrubs later. And in some years, we have lack of adequate fuels, and certainly there's a perception that it's very difficult to burn in the shortgrass region. At least in Wright and Bailey's original book, they said that really not much of a reason to burn in shortgrass, and it's often difficult to do so. More current situation, we see things changing in the eastern tallgrass prairies and in the mixed grass prairies, where we're thinking not in terms of burning whole ranches or landscapes, but more of a heterogeneous application of fire, where you have portions of large pastures burnt and portions left unburnt. Again, we're moving in that direction in the shortgrass also in terms of how we approach implementing prescribed burning. In the tallgrass, a lot of work now is focusing on patchy fires integrated with grazing management to enhance heterogeneity, and that's being driven by increased understanding of how fire and grazing influence habitat for wildlife, species of conservation concern, prairie grouse like lesser and greater prairie chickens, as well as songbirds, and also because of implications for managing tree encroachment. In the shortgrass, we're also interested in patchy application of fire for the same reasons. We're interested in using patch burning to enhance habitat for wildlife, species of conservation concern, and I'll talk about mountain plovers and prairie dogs, and also management for unpalatable plant species, subshrubs, unpalatable grasses, and cactus. So first I want to address the basic question of when does shortgrass burn. For the past 7 years, starting in 2007, every time that we've been conducting prescribed burns at our Central Plains experimental range, we've been collecting data on fuel loads and also putting out data loggers out in the fire where we collect information on the temperature of the fires, temperatures of the head fires at ground level. And so we've pulled together a database from all of those prescribed burns. We're burning both in spring and fall, and each of the rows in this database represents the average of 3 or 4 prescribed burns that are done on a single day. Again, we're measuring standing biomass, the fuel load, some weather variables, and then the fire temperatures. And I'll just briefly show you average peak fire temperatures measured by the thermocouples. And if we graph this out, the best factor explaining variation in peak fire temperatures is fuel load. That's not too surprising considering we're working in a really low fuel environment. And we have a pretty clear relationship here. And then the variation around that relationship is mainly associated with variation in weather variables. So one group of burns up here in the region where we've got about 700 to 1,200 kilograms per hectare fuel loads, and they're burning around 150 to 190 degrees Celsius at ground level. That's right at the height of plant meristems. Another group with lower fire intensity in the 350 to 600 kilogram per hectare fuel load range. And then we have this group down here. This is where our fires completely fail and only propagate in a patchy fashion. So I'll show you what these three groups look like. And also I just want to point out, on the left we have fires which are essentially failed, really not blackening the target area and not propagating in a consistent fashion. This is what happens when we try to burn with fuel loads less than 350 kilograms per hectare. This is more typical in the center of what we prescribe burning conditions, 350 to 700 kilograms per hectare. And this is high intensity fires. So in the center, this is typically the kind of fuel loads we'll get if we have average precipitation and a site that's grazed at moderate stocking rates during the growing season. On the left, this happens about, well, in the past 7 years, we've seen this happen 2 out of 7 years. We've had these conditions 3 out of 7 years, and then we've had these above average precipitation conditions 2 out of 7 years. And what we found is that burning with much lower relative humidity than has traditionally been recommended is necessary in shortgrass. So we're typically burning at relative humidities of 10 to 20%, air temperatures in the 60s Fahrenheit, and wind speeds of 7 to 15 miles per hour. And that really seems to be ideal. And then under those conditions, the two different fuel loads produce the two different temperature ranges. I also want to point out these temperature ranges are quite low, considerably lower than what you get in mixed or tall grass prairie, and as a result are really unlikely to cause mortality of most of the grass meristems, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So in terms of effects on forage production, we've looked at this extensively. We have, working with Dan Melchunas, we've measured effects of fire on forage production on 8 different prescribed burns that were done on Pawnee National Grassland over a 5-year period. For each of those burns, we found no effect of burning on forage production, and this just shows a summary averaged across all 8 of those burns. No effect on forage production and no effect on the plant functional groups. We also did a more recent study, 2007 and 2008, again in collaboration with Pawnee National Grassland, where we did a factorial arrangement of burning and grazing. And so we had sites that were burned and unburned, and then all of the sites were grazed the year before the burn, and then the year after the burn, the first growing season, we had sites that were both grazed and ungrazed. And across all those treatments, again, we found no negative effects of burning on forage production, and no concerns about grazing the site the first year after burning. In that study, we also looked at forage digestibility early in the growing season. In general, forage digestibility, even on unburned sites, is fairly high, but on burned sites, forage digestibility was significantly enhanced by burning. And I'll also point out, for this presentation, I've put citations at the bottom of slides where I've included some data, and if you're interested in details, the PowerPoint will be posted on the Great Plains Fire Science Network's webpage, and you can find the citations there if you're interested in checking them out further. So the next step, what we wanted to look at, was the effect of burning on livestock production. And to do this, we decided to take an approach that integrates fire into grazing management using patch burn grazing. This is an approach that is very well known in the eastern half of the Great Plains and is becoming more and more widely used in tall grass and mixed grass prairies. It seeks to mimic the historic interaction between fire and grazing, and we have prescribed burns applied to only a portion of a pasture each year, allowing livestock to choose among burned and unburned patches. And then burned and intensively grazed patches are shifted in location over time to prevent long-term degradation in any given part of a pasture. So we conducted a patch burning experiment in shortgrass steppe. A lot of folks were saying, well, this really doesn't apply to the shortgrass. It's too arid here. It doesn't make sense. So we wanted to test out patch burn grazing in this more semi-arid environment. We had 3 pastures in traditional treatment, cattle grazing at moderate stocking rates without burning, and then 3 patch burn pastures where cattle were grazed at moderate stocking rates and 25% of the pasture was burned each year. And so this is what the treatments look like. So over a 4-year period, the entire pasture gets burnt. This is a person out here in the middle for scale. And as you can see, even though these pastures are being grazed every year during the growing season, we do have sufficient fuel loads for relatively homogeneous burns, and burned quite well in all 4 years of the study. This ran from 2007 through 2011. And then these pastures were stocked with yearling steers. We put GPS collars on a subset of the steers in each pasture and looked at their selection of burn sites. This is an example. The green boundary shows the boundary of the pasture. This is the quarter that had just been burned. This is the water tank. And then all these blue dots show the location of a steer every 5 minutes for about 3 weeks. Yeah, and so I see the question about erosion after the fall burns. I'll show you some pictures of it I think here in a couple, but we did measure erosion rates both on burned and unburned pastures. I don't have that data in this presentation, but the erosion was quite minimal because when you're burning in shortgrass steppe, the basal cover of the blue grama is substantial, and all that remains after the burn. So in terms of looking at the cattle responses, we see in this case in June of 2008, this is an example where it was during a dry period, hadn't rained in about 3 weeks prior to the start of tracking the cattle, and they didn't select the burn. In August of 2008, after we had some thunderstorms in July and things were greening up, we see pretty strong selection for the burn. So it's variable from month to month. And then this is an example of interannual variation. Here's an example where cattle were selecting the burn in this particular year. The next year, during this time interval, this is middle of the growing season in July, they were really just selecting swales. This is a lowland here and a lowland here, and not selecting the burn at all. So here was controlled by topography. And here they were significantly selecting the burn, but at a lesser intensity than 2 years prior. So a lot of interannual and within season variation. And then averaged over this entire 4-year study, we found that cattle selected burns. They did selectively graze on burns, 31% of their grazing time on burns that made up 25% of the pasture. And we found a really strong selection mainly occurred during periods of green up, with no selection during periods of either unchanging biomass or plant senescence. And this graph is just to show that. I won't get into the details. We also looked at weight gains over the 4 years. These are the 4 years that we burned the pastures. And what we found is in 3 of the years, the first 2 and the 4th, we had no effect on livestock weight gains. In 2010, we had a significant positive effect of burning on livestock weight gains. This followed above average production in 2009, above average plant production in 2009. So we see a benefit in 2010 when we're burning off some of that excess standing dead biomass. And then we also just measured weight gains in 2012. This was a drought year that occurred after 4 years of burning, and we found no residual effects of burning in that 5th year. We're also interested in response to the other herbivore, or other ruminant herbivore that's out here, the pronghorn. We started out just looking at their responses in spring and summer, and there was a response in spring, but it was pretty limited. And just by observation, we realized that they were having a much stronger response to burning in the winter. So these burns were occurring in October or early November. And for about 2 months after burning, we'd see really strong selection of the burns by pronghorn. So just an example. So down here, this green is the densities of pronghorn on burns in the spring. And then the density of pronghorn on unburned pastures, that little blip there is the error bar. So it's like undetectable. So there's a significant difference between spring burn and unburned, or significant difference between burns in spring and unburned. But you can see there's just a huge increase in pronghorn densities in the winter, about 20 times greater. And just by going out and watching them, we realize that they're feeding mostly on the burned cactus cladodes that you can see this stubble here in the foreground of the slides. And we quantified this and found that much higher damage to cactus cladodes on these patch burns as a result of being bitten or uprooted. A lot of the times pronghorn were not consuming the cladodes. They were uprooting the whole plant and then consuming the roots or the bases of the cladodes, but they were really only doing that on burns. And so as a result of that, both the direct effect of burning and the follow-up impact of the pronghorn consumption, we found that fall patch burns had a really strong effect on cactus densities. In the first year, we had an 80% reduction in cactus density, and that persisted out for the next 4 years. In other years, we're getting around 50 to 70% reductions, but strong effects of fall patch burns on cactus. So in terms of cactus, at least in northeastern Colorado, we're particularly interested in this because we have fairly substantial cactus densities in many places. And we've also looked at the direct effects of spring burning on cactus densities. Those burns that I mentioned earlier that we were studying on the Pawnee National Grassland were all done in late winter, typically in March. And we do see a significant effect of those burns on cactus, but that effect is much smaller than what we observe with fall burning. In the spring, with burning, I'm unable to get the slides to advance at this point, but in the spring, when we are, oh, here we go, burning in March or early April, we see a reduced cladode density by about 35% during the first post-burn growing season in one study. This is based on 3 different burns. And then another study that was done several years later, we found cladode density was lower on burn during the first post-burn growing season, but those effects were not statistically significant. Okay, and when we talk about late winter burns, I just want to clarify that. These are typically burns that are being done by the Forest Service on the national grasslands, and these are done at a time when there's no snow cover. Again, you usually have some days in March that are pretty warm, at least up in the 50s, sometimes in the 60s for air temperature, and relative humidity is quite low. I don't know the relative humidity on these burns, probably a little higher than what we typically use, but dry conditions and certainly no recent precipitation. We find there is an effect on cactus, but it's certainly not the magnitude of an effect that we would like to see in some cases. Also, when we return to these studies after the first post-burn growing season, we haven't quantified it, but when you just look around, you're not impressed with the amount of cactus control. With these fall burning studies, we found that it reduces cladode density on average 66%, the range of 50 to 80, and that effect persists out to at least a 50% reduction out to the third post-burn growing season. When you go out to these sites, you can really notice an effect compared to adjacent pastures. Another species I want to talk about is broom snakeweed. In some portions of the western Great Plains, there's interest in controlling this species because it is unpalatable and can be toxic to livestock. Work done by McDaniel and his colleagues in northeastern New Mexico. What they showed is if you're burning in late winter, you can get 65% shrub mortality on average. They also did some work burning in the summer, in June or July, and got much higher shrub mortality. But I just point out they also discussed how this is a much more consistent burn window. If you want to burn in the summer, you really have to wait for just the right conditions. We generally are unable to burn in the summer in northeastern Colorado. And McDaniel, based on his work in northeastern New Mexico, recommending burning with a total fuel biomass of more than 500 kilograms per hectare, which you certainly can get with slightly above average precipitation and moderate cattle stocking rates. Relative humidity, again, quite low, 10 to 20%. That's really what we've seen also. Air temperatures in the 70s, a little warmer in New Mexico. And the most important thing that we found throughout the rangelands where blue grama is dominant, you really have to have blue grama completely senescent. If there's green material in the blue grama, prescribed burning can be pretty difficult. Okay, and then one other example I wanted to talk about. This comes from work being done in the northern mixed prairie in Montana. This is with Lance Vermeer and his colleagues out of Miles City. And what they've shown is with summer burning, they've been able to really have a negative impact on purple freon. This is an unpalatable grass species that sometimes rangeland managers are interested in controlling. With summer burns in August or September, this is when the grasses are, the dominant C4 grasses are senesced. You can get declines of 73 to 90%, and with fall burns in October after the first hard frost, you can get freon biomass declines of 58 to 73%. And they also did a nice follow-up study where they actually quantified how the fire temperatures and the duration of fire temperature above 60 degrees Celsius was related to freon mortality. And what they're finding is they're getting really high mortality rates out in this range. This kind of heat intensity is probably not something you can achieve if you're burning in blue grama dominated rangeland. In the shortgrass steppe, we can probably achieve under high fuel loads, heat loads in this kind of range. And then I just want to conclude with a little bit of talking about prescribed burning for wildlife habitat. This is what's really, I think, driven a lot of renewed interest in prescribed burning in the shortgrass steppe. This is one of the reasons that I think a lot of the national grasslands have started fire programs during the late 1990s. All four of the species shown here exhibit positive responses to prescribed burning. I've already talked about the response of pronghorn. This kind of response has also been documented in the northern mixed prairie, in the western part of the northern mixed prairie, both in Montana and Wyoming, pretty much in other portions of the Great Plains where you have cactus. I won't say too much about swift fox. Swift fox are a species associated with very short vegetation structure. Their main source of mortality is predation from coyotes. So they select short-statured habitats where they can see a long distance. And again, we did one small study in southeastern Colorado on the Comanche National Grassland where we found that swift foxes are at least not negatively affected by prescribed burning in terms of their home ranges, and they selectively place their den sites within prescribed burns. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the other two. This is mountain plover and prairie dogs. So in terms of prescribed burning and prairie dogs, obviously prairie dogs are another species that's closely associated with very short vegetation structure. Well known that they create short vegetation structure, but they also respond to it. We did one study, again, this is from southeastern Colorado on the Comanche National Grassland, where we looked at one wildfire and 4 prescribed burns that were all done adjacent to prairie dog colonies. And this is an example here. This dotted area is the outline of a wildfire. Here's where the lightning struck, burned into a county road that was right here. And then for each of these, this wildfire and for all the prescribed burns, what we do is look at the boundary of the prairie dog colony prior to the burn, and then how much it expands after the burn, and look at how much the prairie dogs are expanding into the burn versus the unburned areas. And we had about twice as high expansion rates into burns compared to unburned grassland. And this was actually during a dry period when prairie dog colonies were expanding quite rapidly, even in unburned grassland. I suspect we'd see a much stronger burn response if we were able to redo this in wetter conditions or in a wetter year. And I do understand, I've talked to some other folks that are that have used prescribed burning to manage prairie dog distribution. At least Christy Painter up on the Thunder Basin National Grassland has mentioned that they've had some success in using burning to manipulate colony expansion patterns up there as well. Another reason we're interested in prescribed burning is in order to manipulate vegetation structure for grassland birds. This is a graphic published by Fritz Knopf in 1996, widely reprinted, and he just was pointing out that variation in habitat for different species of grassland birds often seems to be associated with variation in grazing pressure and vegetation structure. He was arguing that this kind of bare, sparse, prostrate vegetation structure that's associated with breeding habitat for mountain plover is probably driven by either excessive or very heavy grazing pressures. More recently, we've recognized that we can probably also do the same thing and perhaps do it more effectively with prescribed burning. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some work that Justin Durner and I did over the past 5 years looking at use of prescribed burning to generate short vegetation structure in bare ground for breeding mountain plovers. Mountain plover is a species. There's certainly been a lot of interest in managing for this species on public lands in the western Great Plains. It was proposed for listing at the end of the 90s, went through a bunch of litigation, and is currently not listed federally, but is on the list of species of conservation concern for all of the states in the western Great Plains. So here's an example of a mountain plover on its nest in Shortgrass steppe. Hopefully you can see it there in the red circle. This is a mountain plover nesting on a prescribed burn on the Cimarron National Grassland in southwest Kansas. And also it's placed its nest right next to a cow pie. So you can see this species really exemplifies that kind of interaction between fire and grazing. I'd also point out that just the fact that you have a species that responds so strongly to both fire and grazing is probably an indication of the importance of those two processes interacting historically in this landscape. Over a 4-year period, we did a study in northeastern Colorado, both on the Pawnee National Grassland and the Central Plains Experimental Range, where we compared variation in 2 vegetation attributes, bare soil exposure and vegetation height, across different kinds of treatments. And these blue bars here show different levels of grazing intensity. And then what I just want to point out here is that we looked at dormant season burns, both prescribed burns and wildfires, and these were both fall and spring. And we also compared them to prairie dog colonies. We find that prescribed burning is effective in generating much higher levels of bare soil and much lower vegetation heights than is heavy grazing alone, and generates very similar structure to what you find on prairie dog colonies. And then during this same 4-year period, we went out and did extensive surveys trying to find mountain plovers and their nest sites and measure vegetation attributes around the nests. This is an example. This is a 1 square meter plot looking straight down on it and taking a photograph of it. And this is on a prairie dog colony, and here is the mountain plover nest right in the center. And here's another 1 square meter plot on a prescribed burn with a mountain plover nest right in the middle of the 3-egg clutch. And we measured 106 nest and foraging sites over 4 years. And what we found is average bare soil exposure around those sites is quite high, 35%. Average vegetation height less than 4 centimeters. And if you compare that to the management treatments that we studied, mountain plover nest sites, both bare soil and vegetation height is very similar to randomly selected sites on burns and also on prairie dog colonies. And in fact, we found over the past 6 years of surveys on this study area, we've found about half of the nests on prairie dog colonies and about half on prescribed burns or on wildfires. We're also interested in how vegetation structure and variation in vegetation structure generated by prescribed burning influences other bird species. This is from our patch burn grazing study. And here we have variation in vegetation structure among patches in the landscape. Each point here represents a 40-acre site where we measured the average vegetation structure over the 40-acre site and then measured the density of different bird species there. So these sites on the left are sites that have been burned prior to the growing season, and these are sites that haven't been burned yet. And what you see is species like lark bunting are much more abundant in unburned grassland. Species like horned lark are much more abundant in burned grassland. And other species show more dichotomous results. Grasshoppers and brewer sparrows only present at the tall end of the spectrum, and mountain plovers only present on current season burns. So in terms of some of the conclusions from our patch burn grazing management study, I don't think I hit on this slide earlier, so I'll go through them, but we saw no negative effect of burns on forage production and a small positive effect on forage quality. We saw that cattle select burns during green-up, no selection other times in the growing season. A neutral or positive effect on cattle weight gains, a strong pronghorn response during winter, and as a result of that interaction with fire, a negative effect of fall burning on cactus abundance, and overall that burning seems to be effective in managing habitat for disturbance-dependent grassland birds. So I'd say none of these factors are as compelling or as economically important as the results you see in tall grass and mixed grass prairie, but there are a lot of benefits that you can achieve with burning, and with the right spatial configuration, you can mitigate any potential negative effects. Also want to point out in terms of, I think it's important to think carefully about the landscape around a site that you're thinking of conducting a burn in. Just want to give an example from the Central Plains Experimental Range where we did that patch burn study. So in 2006, prior to starting that study, we had 4 large prairie dog colonies at the station, and we had mountain plovers breeding on those colonies. And right at the end of 2006 and early in 2007, all of those colonies died out as a result of plague. So we went from several thousand acres of prairie dog colonies down to just tens of acres of prairie dog colonies. Mountain plovers are migratory, so when they came back in the beginning of the breeding season in 2007, those prairie dog colonies were gone, and instead, the next year we started a patch burn management experiment. And so right at the time when the prairie dog habitat had been lost in the landscape, we were initiating or creating new habitat through our burning program. And I think that's probably one of the reasons that we had mountain plovers breeding on our patch burns each year. And then over that 4-year period from 2007 to 2010, each year we're providing habitat for plovers in that same landscape. So I just want to point out that these, I don't have evidence, I didn't have tags on any of the plovers. We don't know if it's the same birds coming back, but it's quite likely because mountain plovers are phylopatric and generally come back to the same approximate area each year. So for just putting burns out on the landscape randomly, there's going to be a lower probability of actually providing habitat for a species like mountain plovers. And it's important to think about where the source populations may be. All right, so I just want to briefly conclude with some comments on planning for multiple objectives. I think you really can achieve multiple objectives for the plant community, for rangeland management, and for wildlife management if we think carefully about the timing and location of prescribed burns. In terms of bird location, the 3 considerations I think are most important are just, first of all, simply what plant species are present and what kind of opportunities do you have for suppression of things like cactus, snakeweed, or treon. The fuel loads that we have in shortgrass steppe are low enough that you really do have to think carefully about that and whether you can achieve control of those species on a particular site. And then it's also very important to think about pasture boundaries and the timing of cattle use. We can improve forage quality on burns early in the growing season, but if you burn and then you run into a dry year where you don't have a significant green up in the spring, you want to make sure that you still have a significant portion of that pasture that remains unburned and has that residual standing dead forage available for cattle to utilize, at least early in the growing season, before that residual material starts to get lost to wind and lost from just the action of rain and hail. And then in our prescribed burning experiment, in our patch burning experiment, we were burning a quarter of the pasture each year. I would probably, in a management situation, ideally want to be doing less than that, maybe on the order of a 1/10 or an 1/8 of the pasture in a given year, so that you have a substantial amount of that remaining unburned. And I'd also, if you're going to only be burning a small portion of the pasture, that means you're probably going to be needing to work in large pastures so that you can still do reasonably sized burns. And then in terms of proximity to wildlife populations, you need to think about adjacency to prairie dog colonies. And in terms of if you're burning for mountain plovers, adjacency to other past burns or cropland or plague-affected prairie dog colonies that might provide a source population. And then for burn timing, we are in a low fuel situation. I think we can burn in shortgrass. I think we can burn in a lot more years than might be suggested by some of the earlier prescribed burning guides, such as those provided by Wright and Bailey, provided that we have the right weather. But if we don't have enough rainfall during the previous growing season, if you have a drought year during the previous growing season, or a dry year even, it just doesn't make any sense to try burning. Sometimes we get funding to go do a burn in a particular location, we get a dry year, and we go forward with it anyway, and then just have limited success. So you really got to be above that 350 kilogram per hectare threshold, which means we may only be able to burn in 6 or 7 or 8 years out of 10. And then in terms of timing of growth and senescence of the primary fuel species, you need to think about basically when is blue grama senesced and how does that relate to the growth patterns of species you might want to control. That'll help you in thinking about whether you want to use spring or summer or fall burns. And then looking at the weather conditions. Again, we like to be in pretty low humidity, 10 to 20%, and at least have winds that are above 6 miles per hour, temperatures in the 60s. So I think I'm going to conclude here. I just want to conclude with this slide because I think it really exemplifies how you can use fire to achieve multiple objectives. They're all shown here. First of all, we've got a lot of green forage with no standing dead biomass mixed in with it, so you've got an improvement in forage quality for livestock. You can see most of the cactus cladodes in this slide have been killed by the fire. And then also this apparent cladode right here is a mountain plover chick. Mountain plover chicks look like this for about the first week after they hatch, and it's really amazing to me how they look exactly like a burnt cladode, and probably explains why they like to nest on prescribed burns. I also just want to thank a lot of folks that really did a lot of the work on the prescribed burning experiments, Pat McCusker and Dave Smith from here in Fort Collins, Mary Ashby, Jeff Thomas, and Troy Smith, who work out at the Central Plains Experimental Range, and then Nicole Kaplan from CSU. So I think we have time now, and I'd be happy to try to answer some of the questions that I see here below.
David, one person asked on your pasture and grazing studies if you had a change in grass species composition.
So we did a lot of work looking at that. We looked at forage production and plant species composition, and the answer is, if you just want to say herbaceous species or grass species, no, we don't see any shifts. The only effect on the plant community we've seen in prescribed burning is the effect on cactus, and also I should also have mentioned we do see in prescribed burns that have broom snakeweed on them, we also see very similar results in terms of killing broom snakeweed in northeastern Colorado, very similar to what was shown for northeastern New Mexico. But in terms of grass species, we see no effect whatsoever. And again, I think that relates back to what I showed you with the fire temperatures. Those thermocouples we're putting out are at 1 centimeter above ground level, so they're right at the height of the meristems of the grass crowns, and those are not very high temperatures at all. There's not anywhere up in the range where research has shown you start to get plant meristem mortality. We have done a second experiment that I didn't talk about where we've repeatedly burned a site over and over and over. So after burning the same patches for 4 years in a row, we did start to see slight negative effects on the C3 grasses. But we don't see any of that if you burn a site just once or twice.
Thanks, David. I think you have one more question there asking about domestic animals, and have you seen any effects on cactus abundance after fires?
Yeah, we'd like to test that. I think that's a very good idea. Okay, so the question is, can I see any domestic animals having the same effect on cactus abundance after prescribed fires as pronghorn do? I think that's a great idea. I have talked to one rancher up here in northeastern Colorado that has done that. He's had some wildfires on his property and then placed cattle on that pasture when most of the other grasses were dormant, and he told me he had good success with that, but we have not done any experiments with it. And again, I would say you probably need to do that in the dormant season. As soon as you start having some significant green up in the spring, I'm not sure if the cattle will continue to take the cactus.
While you think about any other questions you had, I just want to reiterate that we have recorded the webinar, and that'll get posted on the Great Plains Fire Science Exchange website, and we also plan on posting it at Frames for those of you that can't reach some of the other websites and you're used to using Frames. So we want to thank David for making it through some technical
questions here?
difficulties, and thank all of you for tuning in, and we hope that you learned something new, and this was a valuable webinar. Oh, right. One other point. Those of you that were hoping to get continuing education credits from the Society for Range Management, you can do that by turning in a form, and that form is posted on the Great Plains website. It is also posted to our blog. And if you can't find it in those places, send an email to gpfirescience@missourustate.edu. So if you can fill out that form and send it back to us, we'll get your name on the roster and make sure you get credit. And thanks again. David, did you have any parting words?
No, thanks for hosting this.